So this video is going to walk through the steps to rebuild the shock absorbers from a 1999 to 2001 Isuzu Vehicross, or VX. These shock absorbers were built by KYB. I'll kind of show you the two shocks here. You can see the KYB on the label and marked with Isuzu. This is the front shock, and this is the rear shock, again marked with KYB. Both these shocks are external reservoir nitrogen gas filled shocks, which means that the reservoir here on the rear shock and here on the front shock was filled with high pressure nitrogen gas, which helped eliminate cavitation of the oil in the shock absorber itself. So for the purposes of our walkthrough, the first step in the process is to examine your shock absorbers to see if there are indications that the shock absorber cannot be rebuilt. These would typically be issues with the shaft of your shock absorber. Again, if it had major scratches, was bent, things like that, you probably wouldn't want to try to rebuild the shock. You also want to look for corrosion around the shock absorber. So you can see, for example, this rear shock absorber had some really severe corrosion at the side where the steel reservoir end cap was pressed down into the shock absorber. When we removed the end cap, you can also see the severe corrosion on the reservoir cap seal. This was actually not something we could move or even pull out. So in this case, this particular shock is not going to be rebuildable. For the rebuild process, you're going to need to purchase some materials to rebuild the Isuzu shocks. Both shocks use the same rebuild O-rings, shock fluid, steel seal head, potentially reservoir seal head. So the materials that you're going to need are 46 millimeter outside diameter by 5 millimeter thick O-rings. There'll be a couple of these depending on which parts you decide to replace. You're also going to need 46 millimeter outside diameter by 4 millimeter thick O-rings. Both of the O-rings should be oil resistant. In this case, I ordered these from China. It took about a month for them to come in. They were relatively inexpensive. I think it winds up, you know, 35, 45 cents per O-ring. The 46 millimeter outside diameter by 16 millimeter steel seal head was purchased through United States company. I purchased this through High Gear Suspension out of Freeville, New York, but it's also available from other organizations that sell shock rebuilding materials. You're also going to need shock fluid. I purchased this online from Amazon. This is a heavy duty. There's lots of different kinds here. I don't think it makes that much difference in terms of the fluid itself. A quart will rebuild 2 shock absorbers. You're also going to need some brake cleaner or degreaser, depending on what you want to use. This is going to be used to clean out the inside of the shock itself, clean up the piston seals and the other materials that are inside the shock. Optionally, you can purchase a 1.5 inch inside diameter rubber cap seal. This is from Plumbing Supply. and it can potentially be used as a replacement for the steel reservoir cap seal, although we will be going through a process to see if we can actually reuse ours. Again, depending on the state of your reservoir end cap, you may need to purchase a reservoir end cap seal. Again, this is a 46 millimeter outside diameter with a Schrader valve to pressurize the nitrogen. And again, I purchased this from High Gear Suspension out of Freeville, New York. A couple of optional things that you can purchase is some silica gel. This is for removing moisture from inside the reservoir cap. You could also potentially grab a couple of those small packs that you get in packing materials, dry those in the microwave or the oven for an hour, throw them in a plastic bag, sealed plastic bag until you're ready to use that, and then that can go inside the reservoir cap. I also purchased some 1 1/4 metal chrome valve extensions. Now these are I'm only actually using these for the purposes of pulling the reservoir cap itself out of the shock absorber. If you go and you watch other videos around rebuilding reservoir shocks, and they talk about buying a Schrader valve tool that has a big handle and you screw that in. I was able to do the same thing, screw this onto the end of the cap and use a pair of vice grips to pull that out. So the tools that you're going to need to rebuild the Isuzu Vehicross shocks are as follows. You're going to need a 17 millimeter socket or wrench. That'll be used to remove the bolt at the top of the piston. You're going to need to have a couple of hardened needle pullers. This is going to be used to pull the snap rings out of the shocks. I utilize the hardened sharp end steel punch. I'm using that to actually tap off the steel reservoir cap. I'm also utilizing a center punch here. I'm using that to just kind of manipulate the caps and also to release pressure in the Schrader valve as necessary. Couple of sockets. This doesn't have to be anything perfect. This is about a 3/4 inch socket. I'm using it to push the cap and some other components down inside the shock. Also got a little 1/2 inch steel punch here. Again, this is useful for just kind of manipulating the cap and some other pieces in the shock itself. You're also probably going to want to have a fine file. I'm going to use this to soften the edge of the top of the piston shaft itself to demonstrate that. And optionally, you may consider getting a 12 millimeter tap and die. I'm using this to clean up the top of the piston itself. We remove the bolt, make sure that that's clean. You'll also need a hammer, a couple of pliers, a couple vice grips. You're also going to need a way of putting air pressure into the shock in order to remove the seal between the oil portion of the shock and the gas portion. So that is down inside the reservoir. Not any real way of getting that out with a tool that I found, so eventually I used an air compressor at about 20 pounds and used air pressure to push that seal out. You're also going to need a vise or a way of holding the shock securely, because you're going to need to be wrenching on it, doing a variety of different activities, and you need to be able to hold that steady. You're also going to need a grinder. This can be a wheel grinder, whatever you need. We're going to have to grind off the pinned top of the piston shaft, and we'll show you that in the process. So beyond your hand tools, some way of pressurizing to push the reservoir out, a vise or a way of clamping down the shock, and a grinder to grind off the top of the shaft that's been pinned down. So we've got one of our rear shocks. Took a look at it. It looks pretty good. Don't see any corrosion around our reservoir cap. So the first thing we're going to do in the process is we're going to go ahead and remove this reservoir cap. Now this is a pressed-in steel cap. Not really something that was, I think, ever intended to be rebuilt or reused, but we're gonna try to see if we can get this out of here without tearing it up too bad, so that we can reshape it and potentially use it again. So I've got the shock mounted by its upper aluminum body and the vice grips. Again, when you put this in here, again, this is an aluminum body. You don't want to really crank down hard on it and wind up breaking or distorting the shock itself. Just enough to where that's nice and stable. It's not going to go anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this hardened steel punch, and I'm going to hit this edge a little bit, try to get that to move up a little bit and over. I'm going to go ahead and hit that a little bit. Again, we're trying not to punch through our cap itself. Just kind of see if we can move that a little bit. I'm kind of trying to see if we can slide that up just a bit, tapping in and down just a tad to see if we can keep moving that. So just working my way around this. I apologize for the noise there. We're seeing if we can get this cap to come up in one piece without damaging it too bad. Let's go ahead and we can tap that a little harder. That down. So it does take a little bit of finesse to get that cap off there. But again, our goal here is not to damage the cap as much as possible. I'm going to take my 1/2-inch chisel and just going to tap on this a little bit, just trying to get that cap to move just a bit so that we can try to pry it out of there without damaging it too bad. Eventually, as you kind of work your way around, again, we've got a little bit of an edge here that we're working against. Get that to come up. So I'm going to keep working away at this till I get a little bit closer, and then I'll bring the video back on. So after tapping around the edges of the cap for a while, it became pretty obvious that the cap was really stuck in there pretty well. Didn't want to damage the edge in here any more than I needed to. So what I wound up doing was drilling carefully a couple of small holes here in the top of the cap, being careful not to penetrate the reservoir seal cap underneath this. Once I'd done that, then I was able to stick a pair of needle nose pliers in to the cap, a little bit of leverage, and was able to successfully pop that cap off. Now, as you can see, so we got a couple of holes in here, but this is totally reusable. We'll be able to kind of clean this up, put a little bit of sealer on both of these, and we could probably reuse this cap with a little cleanup. Again, it's a steel cap. You can see the corrosion in here. Every one of these shocks that I've opened up so far have all had some kind of corrosion, some more severe than others. All of them also have a little bit of material in here. I think what this is a desiccant. It's designed to absorb moisture here inside the cap itself, kind of limit the amount of corrosion that's going on in there. So obviously this will be cleaned up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and dump this out, and then we're going to go ahead and get ready for the next step. Okay, so now we've got our cap cleaned out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the Schrader cap off, and that could be pretty tight on there. I'm going to take my needle nose pliers and get a little bit of a grip on that, and carefully pull that Schrader cap valve off. Just working that. That's definitely on there. Doesn't want to come off, but we'll keep working it. All right. So there's our cap. I'm going to go ahead and just blow out around that. So the next thing we need to do then is to discharge any remaining reservoir gas that's inside the shock. Super important to do that. Obviously, you start trying to mess with this, push it up and down, you're going to have all kinds of problems. So I'm going to go ahead and just use this small punch, and you can see, there we go, and that air came out, so we definitely had some gas still remaining in there. That's great. That means that seal was working still. Good thing. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove the reservoir cap. So we'll come right back and we'll go to that step. Alright, now that we've depressurized our reservoir, we're going to go ahead and remove this reservoir cap. This is retained inside the reservoir via a snap ring, which is in the outside here. So in order to access that, we have to actually push this cap down into the cylinder. So I'm going to take my socket here and a hammer, and I'm just going to tap that cover down just a bit. Now hopefully you can see in here that we now have a little bit of a gap. A little hard to see, but there is a steel snap ring right there. So just bring it down enough to where you can start to get a hold of it. I'm going to go ahead and kind of hold on. We have to push on this in a couple of different spots to get that O-ring out. So there it goes. I can see that O-ring. I'll go ahead and work my way around that, get a hold of that O-ring. You do want to hang on to this O-ring. This one's actually in really good shape. It's not very corroded at all, so that's a good sign. This one's got, this valve cap looks real good. So now that we've done that, we need to get the cap out of our reservoir. So what I'm going to do is again take this valve core extender, and I'm just going to go ahead and screw this on here, just standard Schrader valve. Kind of work our way down there. I want to bring that all the way down to the bottom as far as I can get it, right, to get that grip on ultimately on that valve, right, because we don't want it to strip trying to get it back out of there. So I'm going to keep turning that down till I got it down there real well. Just keep working that a bit more. Okay. So there it is. So now I want to go ahead, I'm going to use this extender to bring that cap out of there. So I'm just kind of working it back and forth, pulling it up. This one's coming up pretty well. I'm having problems. I can get a hold of this valve cap extender with a vice grips. Again, we don't, I'm just using this as a tool. I really don't care if I tear this up or not. It's just a way to get it out of here for a couple of bucks rather than spending $20 odd on a specialized tool to do this. So I'm just going to keep working that. You can see it's starting to come up. Let's get that again. Just take your time and work it back and forth. Get that out of there. They're fighting me there a little bit. It may be because of my edging there that I did. Distorted that, but we'll see if we can get that out of there. Alright. Now that we've got our reservoir cap off, we've got our two O-rings removed, the valve inside the reservoir will still need to come out with some air pressure. The next step that we want to do here is we want to go ahead and take this protective cap off of the section of the shock that contains the shaft in it. There are two small holes on either side of this cover. So how I have been taking these off is I've been taking a hardened punch and then taking my hammer and just working on trying to tap that up. I can also kind of gently tap down a little bit of leverage on that. And this one is definitely fighting this. Another thing that I can do with my punch is I can carefully stick that in there and tap that toward the middle, and that'll start raising that up. It might be hard to see, but I'm starting to come up a bit here now. I'm going to go ahead and do that. On the other side, we're going to keep trying to work that without damaging that cap too much. And you're working with aluminum and everything, so you do have to be kind of careful. So I am taking my hardened punch and I'm working that in there as far as I can, and just then kind of tapping that back, kind of working it up. Take your time. Get that cap off of there. We'll keep working that, slightly tapping it one way and the other. Starting to get there now. Once I get it up a little bit taller, a little bit higher, I can then potentially also use my cold chisel. And I'm just tapping up lightly a little bit there. Then we're trying not to damage our cap. Let's see if we can get underneath that from this side. Tap that up some more. It's all aluminum stuff, and it's pretty easy to damage it if you're not careful. So we're just going to keep. There we go. Just a couple whacks, but now we've got that cap pulled off. So now I'll go ahead and bring this over where you can kind of see it. There's your end seal, the steel head cap. Again, this cap is held in place by a snap ring. And we're going to use the same basic idea that we've done before. This time I'm going to go ahead and get my a little bit bigger punch here where I can take and push this down, hopefully without damaging everything. So we'll come right back to that. So our next step is to remove the reservoir piston, which was down at the bottom of the inside of the nitrogen reservoir. This piston has an O-ring on it, and it will move up and down inside the cylinder relationship to movement and expansion of fluid inside the main body of the shock. So in order to remove this piston, we're going to need to pressurize the shock body and use compressed air to bring the piston up to the surface. I've tried opening these up a couple other times. There's just not really any way to pull or get any kind of tool against this piston to effectively pull it out without using some type of pressurized air approach. You could use an air compressor. In this case, I'm just going to use a tire pump. That'll give us enough pressure to get this off of here. What I've done is I've taken the valve body cover, or the seal that we removed in an earlier step, and I've reinserted it into the shock body. So from this position to here, reapplied the snap ring. A little hard to see, but it is in there. Snap ring is in place, and then I've attached my Schrader valve here. I had a little extra line. You could probably do this straight up, but I just made it a little easier for myself. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to push this valve out of the body. Now, you are involved using compressed air. This is a pretty tight fit in here, so again, you want to be smart about this. Don't put yourself or people, anybody else in danger that you might be struck with a flying object with something like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a can that I have here. I'm going to put that over top, and I'm going to shove in behind this a rag, just kind of hold that. Now, so I'm going to hold this can off of the bottom a little bit, so I've got a little bit of space there, should be okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my tire pressure. Bang, I don't know if you could hear it. Didn't take a whole lot of pressure. The piston is now removed from the reservoir body. So the next step in our process is to deal with preparing the top of the shaft to remove the nut. This is holding down all this assembly that's going to need to come apart so we can clean it. Also to remove the steel head and be able to replace that. The problem that we have with our part is that this has been keyed down essentially over top of the nut so that it's become a larger diameter than the shaft and the threads themselves to hold this bolt down pretty much permanently. So in order for us to deal with that, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to grind down this edge so that we can get on this with our socket wrench, pull this bolt off without damaging the rest of the thread. So to do that, I'm going to utilize my grinder. I'm going to slowly, carefully grind this edge down enough to where then we can bolt, or we can clamp this back in, get on this with our socket, and remove this nut. Go ahead and turn our grinder on, and I'm going to begin the process of grinding this off very, very gently. So don't get too crazy with it. So to show you, I'm going to grind a little bit more, but basically what I'm doing here is I'm going along the edges of this peen to thin this metal up. I still got a bit more to go along here. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a bit more off video so you don't have to listen to the grinder, and then we're going to come back and we're going to go ahead and pull this nut off. So I've completed grinding down the edge of the top of the shaft, remove the metal here to help ease removal of our bolt, and now I'm going to remove the bolt from the shaft. Again, this is going to be on here pretty tight. I have it clamped down here at the lower shock mount in my vise, so I've got a steady position. I'm going to go ahead, again, this is a 17mm socket. We're going to go ahead, it's just standard right-left threads, so we're just going to go ahead and we're going to use our socket wrench. Like I said, this is on here pretty tight, and it does kind of pull up through this peened area that we've got. You'll see that once I complete removal of the nut, and it's on there. It's on there pretty good, so you're going to have to put a fair amount of tension on that. You can see here as I'm pulling this up, I've still got a little bit of this metal, so you can get an idea of that peening that KYB did to hold, make sure that that nut was never ever going to come back off of there. I'm not sure how they were able to do that, but it's definitely on there. So now I've removed that nut, and you can see that peening process and how that's impacted quite a bit of the way this nut was very solidly on there. And you can also see that I've got this little bit of metal that's left here on top that was part of that peened over area. So what I'm going to do with these two is I'm going to remove this with a grinder, clean up this edge a little bit, and then double check that my nut can go back down on here. And if it can't, I'm going to go ahead and use my tap and die, clean that up just to make sure that I'm not going to have any problems getting the nut back on there. Cleaning this edge up also is super important in reinstalling your new steel seal head, because if this is really any sharp edges here accidentally damages the inside of your new steel head, you're going to get a leak, and your shock is not going to hold fluid properly. So I'm going to go ahead and grind that off of here. So I'll take my grinder, I've removed that little piece of metal that was up here. I've also done that to my nut, got that cleaned up. So now I've got those two on and off, and this being the bottom here, I can kind of double check that. Look like it's going to go on and off of there. Okay, it's kind of having a challenge because of that little piece of metal. I don't want to damage these threads up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my tap and die set here for this particular setup. I'm going to go ahead and put that. I'm going to go ahead and take these couple of washers off here and just very carefully kind of bring them off. You can see it's kind of struggling to get them off there, so you can tell that outer shaft is maybe needs a little cleanup. Again, we want to remember our order, how those are put together, and I'm going to show you that again as we get through the assembly process. I'm going to go ahead and put those to the side. Show my taps already, dies all ready to go here. I'm going to go ahead and put that on here and see if we can't get that to clean up a little bit. So again, take your time, get that tap on there. Again, we may have to come back and clean that edge up just a bit, because it's kind of fighting me to get a clean edge on that cut. I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grind this just a touch and see if we can't get that cleaned up just a bit more before we try to start the thread together. Alright, so I've ground that top down just a little bit more, clean this edge up enough to where we can get bite on it with our die. I'll push down some pressure on here, try to keep this die nice and straight when I'm hitting that initially. So we'll try that again. We can't get that to start to bite and get a good set of threads going, clean those threads up. Okay. Alright, there we go. Now we're starting to get something. Okay. I'm not going to go too far down, just enough to kind of get that thread cleaned up. That's great. So we got something started there. And just to make sure I'm good on this one, I'm also going to take my nut here and tap through it real quick. This grip make it a little bit quicker, easier to hang on to. I'm going to get a hold of this with my vice grips. Take my tap. Again, I don't have to get too crazy with it. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Just gonna clean that up just a bit. Doesn't have to be real crazy. Alright. Let's just verify that oh yeah, see, now that goes on real nice, so we can definitely get that back on. Not going to have any problems. I'm just going to go ahead and leave that nut on there. Okay, so ground off the top of the shaft, used our 17mm wrench to get the bolt off, cleaned up that peening that was left over, used our tap and die to clean the threads up so we'll get a good get that nut back on there in the reassembly process. So I've removed the piston here, all these pieces, set them to the side. Haven't taken the old steel seal head off yet, but one last thing I'm going to do in kind of preparing this shaft for reassembly is this edge. We've got the smooth portion of the shaft and then the piston area. This edge right here is fairly sharp, right? And we want to make sure that when we reassemble with our new seal head, we don't accidentally cut or scrape that rubber steel that's going to be in there that's going to hold everything together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this real fine mill file and I'm just going to go along the edges of the shaft. Don't have to do a whole lot here. It's really just about smoothing that edge over just a hair, just enough to kind of take that super sharp edge off of it so that when we push down our seal head, we're going to be less likely to damage that head. So yeah, so that's better. Like I said, you don't have to get real crazy with it. When you do this yourself and you feel the edge of that shaft, you're going to feel that sharp edge, and the seal head's going to have to go over top of that without getting cut or scraped, to where that seal doesn't work anymore. So I think that's not too bad. That'll clean that up. That'll make that a lot easier for us to put together. Alright, final step here in clearing off our shaft is I'm going to go ahead and pull the old seal head off, and then the shaft cover that was pulled off in the earlier steps. So that's all of our pieces off the shaft, and we can start our rebuilding process. We've taken apart our shock, so what you should have at this point is your shaft, your lower shock mount, your shaft cover is here, the old steel head. This is your reservoir piston with its O-ring. You should have 3 snap rings. 2 of these a little smaller than the third one. The reservoir seal, Schrader valve's cap, and the reservoir steel cap that we removed in our initial step. So you should make sure that you have all of those pieces, and then your assembly for the piston. So this assembly is essentially, if I take this, kind of break this apart a little bit, you've got your nut and a couple of washers here. You kind of see the 2 or 3 pieces. We'll just kind of put those over the side. Then we have a series of flat steel washers. So there's about 10 of those in a stack, going from small to large. Put that there. Then we have our piston assembly itself. So you can see there's a series of holes here, up and down. So we're going to go ahead and put that back here. Then again, another series of flat steel washers, small to large, so that the largest washers are up against the sides of this piston body. Smaller ones are down at the bottom. Have another small washer, and then our flat washer here, which your steel head potentially would impact against. Now, I'm not sure why they've got these particular set of washers in here. I mean, basically, you know, what happens is the fluid has to flow past these individual washers through these little holes and then back out very small slots, which makes that progression of fluid through this whole assembly very slow, right? And that's what provides the valve effect on the shock effect on everything. But at this point, as you've got all your pieces, we're going to want to go ahead and clean these up. I'm going to remove the O-rings off of these, because these will be replaced. We're going to replace the steel head with a new unit, so that will not require any cleaning of itself. But all the rest of the shock interior, what we want to do is use brake cleaner. You could use degreaser, whatever materials you want. Get yourself some clean rags. But basically what we want to do at this point is get all the old shock fluid off of here, or any bits of metal, anything like that, so that we have a nice clean set of materials to do our rebuild with. So I'm going to go ahead and clean all these up. Don't think it's really necessary for you to sit and watch that process. Again, just kind of make sure you're keeping all your parts in order, particularly this piston assembly, and then we'll come back and we'll start our reassembly. Okay, we've got everything cleaned up now, and we're going to start reassembly. First thing that we're going to do is reassemble our steel head, our piston back on the shaft. Everything's been cleaned up. If you remember, we spent a little bit of time cleaning up the edge of this shaft just a little bit, make sure that that's not too sharp. We don't want to wind up tearing up our steel head when we put that on. I've also got out here a shaft off another shock, just act as a reference. You can kind of see how everything fits back together. This will be the same configuration as what we did in disassembling shaft. The first thing that we're going to go ahead and do is put on our new seal head. So I've got my new one here. I want to remember our orientation. I'm going to go ahead and take the shock shaft, put that down in here, and now we're going to go ahead and install the seal head down onto the shaft. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to use a little bit. Fight me here a little bit. I'm going to get out a little bit of polyurethane grease, and I'm going to apply that on the inside here. You could do make like special grease for O-rings and stuff. This polyurethane grease, in my mind, is very stable. It's not got really any kind of chemicals in it that are going to mess up our seal here. So we're going to go ahead and put a little bit of that on here. And now again, being careful before we pop the seal towards the lower shock mount. I'm going to go ahead and bring that over and very carefully get that over top of our threads. We don't want to damage anything. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to carefully roll that seal down over the top. There we go. That felt pretty good. See, there's my seal is on there. I'm going to go ahead and we'll push that down into that area. So that's probably one of the most critical pieces of making sure that we've got a good seal there. We didn't tear up anything, because otherwise I have to wind up buying another one of these. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and put on our shaft assembly. If we kind of look at that configuration, go ahead and put our big flat washer on there. And then we're going to take our piston assembly. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to turn this upside down. I'm going to go ahead and set those washers down on there. Kind of work that. May have to sit there and play with that just a little bit. Get all those washers on our shaft. Again, just take your time. More of these. Kind of work that down. So again, basically what's happening is you can kind of see the progression of the washers is getting bigger and bigger as I move through this. And I'm going to go ahead and put the piston itself in there. And then on top of that, I'm going to come back with our second set hardened washers. Again, that making sure that the largest of those are here, going up against the piston itself. Again, not really sure if there's any rhyme or reason as to why they have all these different rings on here. Basically trying to get all that back together like it was when we disassembled it. Our last few pieces, and now we're ready to put on our nut. So before we do that, what we want to do is we're going to put a little bit of thread lock on here, and then we're going to peen that nut back on here. So to do that, I'm going to take this whole assembly and put it back on the vise. Alright, so we've got our shaft back on the vise. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put a little bit thread lock on our bolt here. If you ever use this kind of stuff, you don't need a whole lot of it. Just a drop or so, get that work its way into those threads. we're going to go ahead and take our 17mm socket and, sorry about that, see that okay? I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down. Feel that tighten up. A hard turn. Don't really have any torque specs or anything that I've been able to reference for how KYD would have originally set this up, so I don't really have that. And as a little bit of an added piece of protection, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to lock this shaft by peening this with my chisel. Get that to where we can hopefully get the two of those kind of merged together so that they don't move. You can see kind of what I'm doing there. I'm taking and peening that edge, that shaft down. Locking those two together, so that should help keep that from coming off inadvertently, right? Obviously we don't want that bolt or that nut to come off the shaft. Alright, so we've got our shaft all set up and ready for reinstallation. The next step, now that we've got our shaft all set up, ready to go, we're going to go ahead and put our O-rings on our piston, the reservoir, and the reservoir top seal. So the piston utilizes a 5mm thick by 46mm outside diameter O-ring. The reservoir top cap here utilizes a 4mm by 46mm outside diameter O-ring. So these are the old ones that came off of our original shaft, and we'll set those over to the side. I have my replacements that I purchased. Again, I had to wind up ordering these from China. They took about, one of them actually took more than a month to get to me. So it did take a while. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a little bit of grease on here. Just make sure that these are all okay. Put that all the way around that a little bit. And then we're going to go ahead and stick that 5mm onto our piston shaft. Again, you want to make sure when you're ordering these from China, Amazon, eBay, whatever, make sure that you're getting the ones that are oil resistant. They do make different types of materials. Again, these were pretty inexpensive. I think, I bought 10 in a package. It's only like, $5 or $6. Again, this is recording this in February 2019 time frame, but really pretty inexpensive to get the O-rings. Just took a long time. Again, I'm going to go ahead and get this O-ring on here. So now I've got a good O-ring. As you remember, when we disassembled this, we still had gas in the reservoir. So I feel very confident that this Schrader valve in here is working really well. You could certainly go out and purchase a new Schrader valve if you felt like you needed to replace that or didn't feel like it was sealing properly. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and reuse that. All right, so we've got our shaft rebuilt, ready to go. We have our piston, got our reservoir cap, and a little bit of lube on them. We have our 3 snap rings. Again, you want to make sure these are all nice and cleaned up, good to go. Again, we have 2 smaller diameter snap rings. These 2 are going to go in the reservoir. The larger one will be the snap ring for our seal cap keep that all put together. So one of the things that we have to deal with here is setting the depth of our piston inside the reservoir. Again, the reservoir is connected between the main shaft of the shock and the reservoir. There's a hole between the two of these so that oil can pass back and forth. So I've opened up several of these shocks, and every single one of them has the piston at a different depth, all the way down the bottom. I've seen it, halfway up, somewhere in there. So because there's not really any, I haven't been able to find any specific information, from KYB or anything related to the exact setup of these shocks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split the difference. The depth of our reservoir down to the bottom is approximately just a bit less than 4 inches up to the snap ring that holds the piston from going all the way up and hitting the bottom of our cap. The piston itself is roughly just about 5/8, a little bit more than that. Let's call it between 5/8 and 3/4. So the way I would look at this is we'll kind of split the difference. We'll push this down so that I've got about roughly 1 3/4 inches, maybe a little less than that, from the top of the piston to the top of the snap ring, and that'll give us about halfway between, give or take just a bit. Again, maybe if someone comes up with that information, after this video gets posted, you can make some comments on that. That helps some folks out. But we're gonna take our best shot at figuring that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my piston on. Go ahead and take my vise and put this in here, and we're going to go ahead and then install our ring. Again, the scenario of putting this back in is the inside of the cap. See the hollowed out area? That's going to be up towards the cap. So the flat side, a little bit less, is going to go towards the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and set that here, and then I'm going to take my hammer and my socket, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to tap that down in there. As you can see, going down, and get that past the O-ring. I'm going to go ahead and send that down a little bit farther. Stop right there for a second. Let's just go ahead and measure that and see how we're doing. We're about at 1 inch, so I'm going to take that down about roughly another 3/4 of an inch. So we'll just rough this in. That's going to be pretty close there. We'll just double check that again real quick. Yeah, that's about 1 inch and 3/4. So that should be roughly about halfway in between. Next thing I'm going to go ahead and do then is I'm going to install my lower snap ring. I'll go ahead and hopefully you can see this okay. Go ahead and stick that snap ring down in there. Make sure I have the right one. I do. Push that down. Make sure that snap ring gets set. Okay, cool. So now that piston will be blocked from coming all the way up. So that's great. So now that I've got the piston in place, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start loading the shock with shock oil. And one of the challenges that we're going to have here is getting as much air, or all air in a perfect world, out of this shock. And so that can be a challenge here with obviously having the reservoir sealed off. We don't have any way of getting oil in there. I could have poured oil in there potentially, but then I'm introducing air when I push down with my piston. So we've got a challenge there. I think that the way probably KYB handled this was there is a small set screw here based on an Allen wrench that they probably used to pull out, let the extra oil come out when they were setting everything up. The problem I've run into this is that in a couple of these that I've already tried to take off, this set screw is absolutely fused to the body of this aluminum shock. No way that I could move it. The only way that I could possibly get that out of there would be to drill it out, retap everything, and then put that back in with some sealer. Right? I did try to do that. Didn't have real good success. So I'm trying to avoid taking this set screw out of here, so that we're gonna try a different way of potentially getting the oil out of our air out of our reservoir. All right, so we're going to start filling up our shock. What I'm going to go ahead and do, I've got my shock fluid here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pour shock fluid in here, maybe about halfway or so up in my cylinder. So I've got that in there, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to temporarily cover my end of my shock here with this is just a piece of PVC that I've drilled a hole in. I'm going to locate this with a clamp. And basically, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put this so that my hole is up here towards the top. Clamp this board on here, and then I'm going to not totally invert, but I'm going to move this shock around with the hopes of getting the air out of our getting the air out of the shock as efficiently as possible. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and set that hole. I can just kind of barely over the edge. I've got my piston here. It's a little tough to do when you're single hand here, but I've got it over we've got that just barely over that hole. I'm going to go ahead and see if we can tighten this up so it doesn't go anywhere. Alright, so that's pretty tight, and I got a little bit of an air gap there. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take this out, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to invert this onto its side. Just kind of shake that, hoping. So what we're trying to do here is potentially get that oil, get that air out of there and get that oil into my reservoir. So I'm just going to take that and just bounce that a little bit. Keep doing that process. So hopefully our goal here is our oil will move down in there, fill that up. We're kind of just trying to get as much of that air as we possibly can out of that shock. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this for a little bit offline, and then we'll come back and take our next step. Alright, so we've done a little shake and bake to our shock. Hopefully the goal here again is we've managed to get air as much as possible out of our reservoir area. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put our shaft back in. So I've got enough fluid in here where I'm about maybe an inch and a half off the top. I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to reintroduce my piston, and I'm just going to really slowly let this piston go into the shock. Don't want the oil to go all over the place. We're just looking to let that gently go down in there. We'll take our time, let it work its way down, and just trying to make sure that we're not overflowing. Now I can pull that piston up a bit, and I can see that oil. Just take it nice and slow. We'll just go ahead and just let that flow on down in there, so we'll give that a second or two, and then we'll go ahead and do our next step. Alright, so we're working our way down here, the piston shaft. I'm going to go ahead and tighten that up a bit so I can pull that shaft up. One of the things that we're kind of looking to do here with our piston is make sure there's no air in there, so I'm just going ahead and pushing down. And something you may or may not notice here on my other side is my piston in my reservoir has gone up, so we're going to have to recheck that, check that position. So that is being pushed up by the fluid. Again, we're a little bit high at this point. Need to push that back down. Double check that again. That'll have to come down a little bit more. Up against our ring. So there it went. So we're pretty close there. Pulling piston up. I'm going to go ahead and bring that piston. You can see it's really definitely moving up and down there. So there, the two of them are working in relationship to one another. We just want to make sure we have that at the right position. Pull that up. Pull that piston up, and it'll definitely pulls it. We've got that. That's about correct position there. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring my seal head down onto our setup here. And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to try to go ahead and get that piston head down in there. Now this is going to be, going to have to try to force that a little bit, so we want to tap that down. So I'll go ahead and get I'm going to use a bolt there to do that. Give me a second, and then we'll go ahead and start tapping that in. Okay, so now what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to get this seal to go down in here without damaging anything. So I'm going to probably use my little alignment tool here. It's got a flat edge. Tap that. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that head down past its groove so we can put the O-ring in there, or the snap ring. So I'm going ahead and I'm tapping that. Go ahead and push that down past the O-ring just a little bit. There it is. Push that down just a touch more. I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's our O-ring groove there. Ready. I'm going to go ahead, bring my larger diameter snap ring, get that started in the groove. we go. We want to make sure again that that is absolutely set down in that groove. We want to have this popping out. Alright, so starting to get there. Make sure that that looks good. And we can pull that piston up. Is looking real good. Snap rings in there properly. Alright, so one of the things that so that's going up and down here on my other end. So I bring that up, push that all the way down, I'm getting that good movement. So now what I've got is I've got my shaft in place. I've got my O-ring there, just kind of I double check that. Right now the two of them, that's sitting at about an inch. Let's see if that's a little bit lower there, but that's not too bad. So we've got ourselves in a position now where we've got the shock reassembled. At this point, you could go ahead and tap back your shaft cover. Looking good. And then the final step that we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and put our seal cap back in place. I'm going to go ahead and turn our shock around so you can see that step. So we're going to take our seal cap, push that, I'm going to take my socket, set down here somewhere. Here. Go ahead and set that over top, and we're going to gently put that seal cap. One of the things we may have to wind up doing with this is, because that's a good seal there. Let's see if this will help us a little bit. Don't want to tap on that. Let's see if we can get that to come down a bit more. It's definitely fighting us there. There it goes. There it goes. Took a little bit for it to make sure that was going down. I'm going to kind of, I don't know if you heard that or not, but there was a little bit of already compression going on. Go ahead and keep. There we go. Get it past that second ring. Oh, and I can feel that air. Let me stick this down in the middle, see if we can release that a little bit. It's coming up. There we go. So now it's starting to move. I want to, and there's my O-ring, my third O-ring. Go ahead and place that back in here. And want to make sure that it's all lined, set up good. That looks real good. So now at this point, you would take this shock to a motorcycle service or 4x4 shop that does shock repair, someplace that will do nitrogen recharging. So you would take the shock in and have them go ahead and fix that, and charge this with nitrogen. We'd probably be looking at something, call it between 150, 180 pounds on the shock. Can do a little bit here with our pump, just to kind of simulate that just a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and get my pump here, and see if we can't put a little bit of air in this or not. So yeah, there we go. So I'm just going to simulate a little bit of air in this thing. Again, you could use a compressor, and hopefully we've got that charged up just a bit. So I'll go ahead, and then I've got my cap back on there to protect that. Assuming that this has come back, then your final step then is going to be to cover this back up. So let's take a look at that. Alright, assuming that we got our shocks back, it's been nitrogen charged, good to go. Finally, we'd want to go ahead and protect this cap, our seal cap here for the reservoir. So you remember in our earliest steps, we removed this cap from the reservoir. Again, tried to pop that off by tapping it on the sides. Wasn't totally successful with that. Ultimately wound up drilling a couple holes. Carefully pull this out. So the cap in and of itself, has some corrosion inside of it. Doesn't mean that it's not reusable. So what I would be recommending around this to reuse this would be first to treat this with a little bit of a rust inhibitor or a good primer. Spray this cap down with some good quality rust inhibiting paint. So we've got kind of keep it and protect it. Then once that's dry, I would be recommending putting a little bit of dab of silicone on each of these to just fill up those holes, right? So it's basically watertight again. And then in reinstalling the cap, I would maybe suggest a couple things. One of the things that I've seen with a lot of these shocks that I've taken apart is that if there has water or moisture has gotten by here, that snap ring can get pretty corroded, right? Because part of the problem is that because you have two dissimilar metals, you have a hardened steel, and then you have the aluminum. That galvanic action is it'll start creating quite a bit of corrosion there and particularly eroding the aluminum. So what I might recommend is a couple things. One would be to take a little bit of your silicone and place that all the way around a little bit to kind of seal that snap ring so that it's not getting any moisture to it. A little bit of silicone around our exterior, and then carefully tap that back in. Another thing that you could do is to put a little bit of desiccant beads into the top of this cap before you seal everything up. That way, these can also help absorb any moisture that might get past this, reduce the chance of any galvanic erosion that might occur. Put that kind of make that environment into a scenario where hopefully it'll be nice and pristine another 100,000 miles or so, depending on how long you're able to go with your shocks. You get this back out of there again and potentially reuse it. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my shock out. You can see now, even though I don't have a huge amount of pressure on that, we'll go ahead and that shock will definitely will pressurize everything some more. But now we've got definitely working. Got a little bit in there, but definitely something that's reusable now. So hopefully that walks you through the steps.